snake oil, clairvoyancy, stockbroking, salacious journalism, free love, scandal, divorce, eugenics, and the presidency. Hi, I'm Arjun McLaughlin. This is The History Show, and all I have to say is buckle up, because to tell this story, we need to have the energy and audacity of its subject, Victoria Claflin Woodhull, the first woman to run for US president in 1872. That's almost 50 years before women in the US finally clawed their way to the national right to vote. And this is her story. I'm fascinated to learn that US history is filled with unprecedented, rule-bending elections. The founding thinkers may have left us a partial map, also known as the Constitution, but it's filled with gaps and spots up for interpretation. And that leaves a lot of room for people to get pretty crafty, like finding a loophole that lets you run for president when you can't even vote. In many ways, Victoria Claflin, later Victoria Claflin Woodhull, even later possibly Victoria Woodhull Blood, and even later Victoria Woodhull Martin, don't worry, we'll get there, is a quintessentially American story. I first learned about her when I realized the first women I'd heard of launching presidential campaigns, like Shirley Chisholm or Elizabeth Dole, were from the late 20th century, and I wasn't sure who actually came first, so I searched it up, and turns out a quick Google search of first female presidential candidate will blow your mind. If you start with Wikipedia, where so much research starts but should never end, Victoria Claflin was born in 1838 in Homer, Ohio. And I always have to remind myself what the US looked like in the 1800s. What do you mean Oregon was pretty much all of the Pacific Northwest? Oregon. No shade to Oregon, but that's huge. In the year 1838, the US had only 26 states. Martin Van Buren was president, the telegraph debuted publicly, the Trail of Tears began, forcing thousands of Native Americans to relocate from the south and southeast of what's now the US. The complete version of Oliver Twist by Charlie Dickens was published. Proteins were named for the first time. Really weird beards were also the look. Thank God that trend has gone the way of smallpox. And yes, importantly to our story, the first woman to go on to run for US president has entered the world on the fair day of September 23rd, 1 month and 1 day before my birthday, and also 167 years. Now, Victoria was noteworthy pretty much from the beginning. Her mom was a follower of the new spiritualist movement, which believed that people's souls stuck around after death and could be contacted, often through a medium. And her dad was a, quote, con man, lawyer, and snake oil salesman. 3 ways to say the same thing, am I right? I'm kidding. Lawyers, we need you. I read on about how she grew close to her youngest sister, Tennessee, how she only had around 3 years of formal school, how her father insured a mill he owned and then burned it to the ground, leading the town to run them out of the state of Ohio, which in turn made them become traveling fortune tellers / medicine salespeople. And how at only 14 years old, she met the 28-year-old Dr. Canning Woodhull, who was probably a quack since you didn't need a license to call yourself a doctor at this point in Ohio. Married him at 15 and had 2 children before she was in her mid-20s, which is still pretty young to get married even by 19th century standards. It turned out that along with being twice her age when they met, Dr. Woodhull was not great on a lot of different levels. He was an alcoholic and a womanizer and depended on Victoria to work to support them both. So even though divorce was complicated and socially frowned upon for women to obtain, and stuck with her with a whole slew of problems afterwards, mid-20s Victoria divorced her first husband, but kept his surname. This is where things start getting a little hazy Wikipedia-wise. At some point, she claimed to get married for a second time, though no paperwork was filed, possibly worked as a medical clairvoyant, and eventually moved to New York with her sister to become the first female stockbrokers, thanks to the backing of Cornelius Vanderbilt. Yes, that Vanderbilt, as in the railroad tycoon who now has a university named after him. Apparently, he was in his 80s at the time and hired both of them to help contact his dead wife. I don't know if it worked or not. Now, that's definitely quite an origin story, one that does a pretty good job of encapsulating our American ideals of hard work, grit, and pulling oneself up by the bootstraps, with just a pinch of pseudoscience. But I'm still wondering exactly how we went from all of that to her running for president, especially considering she couldn't even vote. That's what led me to backtrack to another pivotal character in our story, the fight for equal rights, and specifically women's suffrage in the US. It turns out the equal rights movement is way spicier than headlines like the women's suffrage movement started with a Tea Party would lead us to believe. So much so that we should probably go ahead and make a whole episode on it. I mean, there's a whole Broadway show just about one slice. But for our purposes today, we're really going to focus in specifically on how Victoria got involved. So back in 1838, when Victoria was born, we only know of around 3 or 4 places that gave women the right to vote throughout Europe and their various colonies. And even then, it's often only specific women. Before that, there are a few examples of women's suffrage in history, but again, throughout much of world history, women's opportunities for political participation have been limited. And here's where I had to mostly leave Wikipedia behind to figure out how a fortune-telling divorcee from rural Ohio intersected with the global suffrage movement. As I turned to more reputable sources, a few things came up. There are short bios of Victoria on the National Women's History Museum, along with the National Park Service websites, and a handful of articles by places like NPR, Time, and Mental Floss, published during the last few election cycles of the 2010s and 2020s. And they do corroborate the core of what I'd already learned. As the National Park Service says, Victoria Claflin Woodhull was one of the 19th century's most colorful characters. I mean, duh, but they also enriched the picture I had already had with key details that I think were really important to the trajectory of her career. Namely that after her divorce, those mysterious psychic healing services she offered opened up a bunch of doors for her. It's how she met her second husband, Army veteran Colonel James Harvey Blood, which has to be a top 5 name of all time. And also how she and her baby sister Tennessee, also a pretty cool name, made their living. And it was how she and Tennessee first fell into the orbit of the one and only Cornelius Vanderbilt. By 1870, the sisters and Victoria's second husband, along with her 2 kids, let us not forget she was doing all of this with 2 kids, one of whom had an intellectual disability and required lifelong care, all moved to New York City. Here they met Vanderbilt, and it was thanks to his shrewd business advice along with his seed money that they were able to start the brokerage Woodhull, Claflin & Company and amass a fortune. Also, if you're watching this and you're a railroad tycoon with free trading advice and seed money, please email me. My email is RJ... What's up? Fine, we'll talk later. This meant they became the first women to operate any sort of financial firm on Wall Street. In the press, they were billed as the bewitching brokers and the queens of finance. They also only took female clients because they believed that financial independence was key to a woman's independence, which is pretty cool. And all these details were pivotal for what was about to come for Victoria, because it's with these profits from their stock brokerage and funding from Vanderbilt that the sisters launched their very own newspaper, Woodhull and Claflin Weekly. And this is when Victoria's foray into politics, women's workers' equality, and women's suffrage really gets rolling. Now, Woodhull and Claflin wasn't just some gossip rag, right? Victoria wrote persuasively about free love, which argued that marriage did not have to be for life. With free love, people should be able to stay with romantic partners as long as they chose and then separate without the stigma of divorce. Which doesn't mean Victoria was pro-polycule or even that she was anti-monogamy, but it still was a pretty radical view at the time. She also wrote about women's suffrage and progressive political reform. In fact, the Weekly is the first in the United States to publish an English translation of Karl Marx's The Communist Manifesto. Scandalous. Now, these radical articles, particularly the ones on free love, are actually the main thing Victoria is remembered for these days, particularly in academic circles. And while some people have written that Victoria was introduced to these progressive views by her second husband, I really think that's doing her a disservice. She was the one, after all, who faced a difficult marriage at 15, managed to obtain a divorce in her mid-20s, and struck out on her own in a world where, as a woman, all the odds were stacked against her. And much like how social media and the internet are essential for politicians, organizers, and basically anyone trying to share their ideas today, newspapers were really where it was at when it came to growing ideas and building a strong following. Victoria herself said it really well in an 1872 speech in a section about how awesome the printing press was. Where kings and emperors once used the sword to hew their way into the centers of barbarism, the people now make use of their subtle powers of intellect to pierce the heart of ignorance. This written word was key to the revolution and societal change she was working for. In particular, throughout the 1800s, newspapers were pivotal to the US forming a national identity and disseminating diverse perspectives. Remember, in 1838, there were only 26 states, but by the election of 1872, that number jumped to 37. And from the year 1800 to 1860, the number of newspapers went from 200 to 3,000. The physical and societal shape of the US was very much in flux throughout the 19th century. And the reach of newspapers such as Woodhull and Claflin Weekly, along with others like Harper's Weekly or Atlantic Monthly, was key to how people read about and conceptualized their US identity. I mean, there's that classic quote, "Before the Civil War, the states were all separate. People used to say the United States are. It wasn't until the war ended people started saying the United States is." What's up? Oh, that was from National Treasure, not a historical document? Oh, it still sounds pretty good. I'm still gonna use it. Either way, the ideas Victoria was outlining in her newspaper were a big deal when it came to shaping the future of the country, and the fight for women's rights in particular. Woodhull and Claflin Weekly had a readership of 20,000. And Victoria and her ideas became the subject of other publications too. She also became a prominent speaker for at least one arm of the women's suffrage movement throughout the early 1870s. In 1871, Victoria was the first woman to testify before a committee of the US House of Representatives, along with fellow suffragists Susan B. Anthony and Isabella Beecher Hooker, when they addressed the House Judiciary Committee to argue that women in the US actually already had the right to vote under the 14th Amendment. You know, the one that states that anyone born in the US is a citizen of the US and can't have their rights infringed upon without due process. They also cited the 15th Amendment, which says that the right to vote can't be denied based off race. To which the House Judiciary Committee said, "Oh, no, you're wrong." Now, I'm not a constitutional scholar, but I did skim the Constitution when researching, so I'm probably on par with a lot of Congress in that way. But in my searching of the original articles, I couldn't find the right to vote discussed anywhere at all. And that was a big surprise to me. It turns out that the original Constitution only discusses very generally how Congress and the president and vice president are elected, but not much about the actual right to vote. Who gets to vote and how seems to be one of those things left up to the states, which left me feeling pretty shocked, to be honest. But when it comes to the actual outlining of voting rights, it actually tracks with what I know to be true today. Think about how there can be different rules from state to state around the documents you need to register to vote, or the rules and timelines of mail-in ballots. It also explains other weird loopholes, like how convicted felons can't vote in certain states, but can run for president and win. And it explains why our protagonist was able to throw her hat in the ring for the presidency in 1872. Despite women not getting universal suffrage until 1919. As NPR pointed out a few years ago, at the time, in 1872, women were not allowed to vote, but there were no laws against launching a presidential campaign. Perhaps because no one could have ever imagined that a woman ever would. As far as her campaign went, Victoria used her acclaim as a journalist and public speaker, as well as strategic milking of drama within the suffrage movement, to her advantage. She was nominated for presidency by the Equal Rights Party, a minor party whose main issue was, you guessed it, equal rights for women. And her VP pick? You might know him. He was a guy by the name of Frederick Douglass. Yes, famed abolitionist Frederick Douglass, though it's not clear whether he ever acknowledged the nomination. But it's still pretty cool. Now, thrust into an even brighter spotlight, Victoria was criticized and harangued throughout the media like only an eccentric woman can be, especially when they found out that she let her non-functional first husband move in with her family in order to support him and care for his addiction. She punched back at the morality double standard women face and kept her own newspaper running by publishing more, let's say, salacious stories. Mid-election year, one of those stories targeted her outspoken critic, the prominent and married Minister Henry Ward Beecher, who had an affair with one of his congregants, exposing the hypocrisy of someone calling her a bigamist while having an extramarital affair. However, political opponents leapt on this as a way to silence her campaign. They raised obscenity charges against the newspaper, which meant she and her sister and Colonel Blood spent the election day in jail and were eventually bankrupt by continuous lawsuits launched by her opponents. They were acquitted of all charges, by the way. So, did she actually expect to win? No, probably not. But did the signers of the Declaration of Independence really believe in their heart of hearts the US could throw off British rule? No matter what happened, wasn't it about speaking up and taking a stand? And I do have to point out that even if she had, by some miracle, won the election, Article 2 of the Constitution does specifically state that someone has to be 35 to be president, and Victoria was only 34. So she wouldn't have been able to take office in the first place. But that really wasn't the point, was it? What I take from her historic run, even though she lost, looking back from my seat in the 21st century, is that our electoral system needed some serious work, that women belonged in politics, and that the women's rights movement was a force to be reckoned with, and that it's our responsibility as Americans to stand up for what we believe in. After the 1872 election, more women we don't remember ran for president in elections on Victoria's heels, like Belva Ann Bennett in 1884. In the US, the territory of Wyoming was the first to pass legislation about women's suffrage in 1869, 3 years before Victoria's bid for presidency. But throughout the late 1800s and early 1900s, several other mostly Western states followed suit. But for national recognition, women in the US were still waiting. As for our illustrious candidate, Victoria's reputation was getting shakier. Other suffragists started distancing themselves from Victoria because of her radical stance about free love and general woohoo vibes, especially since they were trying to make women's suffrage palatable to all and worried that those fringy beliefs and jail time would scare off supporters. Then in 1876, the same year her paper folded, Victoria divorced her second husband, and just a year later, Cornelius Vanderbilt died. Remember I said old Vanderbilt was an important connection for Victoria and Tennessee? Well, even after his death, he would go on to provide for the sisters through the end of their lives. Not really on purpose, though. Now, there's some debate, but it seems that the Vanderbilts' heirs paid Victoria and Tennessee to move to England rather than have them around to contest Vanderbilt's will and wreak general Victoria-flavored havoc. And the rest is pretty much more of the same for Victoria. And by that, I mean she charmed a third husband, English banking heir John Biddulph Martin, and started another publication, this time with her daughter. It was called The Humanitarian, and like the rest of Victoria's storied career, some of it was banging. And some of it, like the discussion around eugenics, which were really in vogue at the time, are what we now call deeply problematic. Now, Victoria did live to see the 19th Amendment pass in 1919 and be ratified in the US in 1920. And of course, she remained an outspoken advocate for all her beliefs, including women's suffrage around the world, until her death in 1927. These days, Victoria's name is just starting to be bandied about again as more women run for president, almost 150 years since her initial run. And that in and of itself is interesting, especially when you consider how much of a public figure she was and how much work she had published in her lifetime. I mean, the famous political cartoonist Thomas Nast dedicated an illustration just to her as Mrs. Satan. Clearly, Nast had some feelings. But what made her so provocative and notorious at the time may also be why she has largely been written into only the footnotes of history. When other suffragists distance themselves from her because of her radical beliefs and tangle with obscenity charges, they also wrote her out of their own history. As Victoria goes on to say in that same 1872 speech from before, "I am a revolution. If not to get equality and justice, it is required." Victoria was willing to push boundaries, and that instability can be frightening and off-putting. Learning about Victoria now, I'm not only stuck with all those fascinating, eccentric details, but how her life and legacy reflect a sort of microcosm of the American experience. I mean, coming from nothing to build a journalism empire, breaking all the rules, getting stuck in the push and pull of progress and tradition. To me, it seems like Victoria was largely making it up as she went along, which is kind of the whole American deal. Take the Constitution itself. The very thing Victoria and her fellow women's rights advocates took up in their fight for equal rights and universal suffrage. The founding thinkers created it specifically to be amended. In fact, that's the whole point of Article 5. It's meant to be amended. It's meant to be made up as we go along, adding important clarifications like the 19th Amendment, as well as all those other future bound-breaking amendments still to come, like the Equal Rights Amendment that has yet to be added. And just because something's in the Constitution now doesn't mean the fight is over. Here in the 2020s, debates about women's rights continue. And 150 years later, we still haven't had a female president. We've only had one female VP. We're still writing and rewriting history and making it up as we go along, who we want to be as individuals and as countries. And when faced with injustice, we, like Victoria, might just need to get a little creative. Thank you so much to everybody who helped make this episode. If you have any other buried historical stories you want us to dig up, let us know in the comments. If you see stories below that you like, you can upvote them and we'll add them to our ever-growing list of topics. Also, if you want to see more of what we're up to, you can join the Complexly newsletter by visiting complexly.com. I'm RJ McLaughlin. Thank you so much for joining me on this History Show episode, and I will see you later.